The next form of writing that we're going to deal with is called the parable. The parable. Now, of course, we often think of Jesus as being the initial user of this concept called parable. But you need to realize is that Jesus isn't the first person to use parables. In fact, parables are an established form of teaching within the Middle East. And not only within Judaism, but within the whole Middle East. The whole Middle East has a habit of using parable as a means of teaching. And in fact, still does today. The use of narrative or story to teach is a major part still of the Middle Eastern way of teaching. And so what we need to see is that parables are within Tanakh as well. In the book of Isaiah, for example, there's the story of a vineyard. If you look at the other prophets like Ezekiel and Jeremiah, they would often use parables. Now, what's a parable? Well, a parable is a made-up story with a parallel meaning, or at least a point, an undergirded meaning. So something where the story leads you to understand something about God or about ourselves or about our faith or about the way in which we live out that faith. It's a made-up story. So it's not based necessarily in history, but rather based in context. And this is the problem for parable. Is that the problem for us with parable is that we live in such a different context. If you look even at the New Testament concept of parable, you realize that Jesus always used parables which were connected to the context of the people he was talking to. Of course, the people he was talking to lived in the desert, lived in warfare, lived in an environment where there was an agrarian context or an agricultural context. Of course, for us who live in cities, it's very hard then to really understand what is it that the parable means. And so, of course, parables become the first real difficulty for us. Mythology we can begin to understand, legend we can have some understanding, but once we start getting into parables, we start realizing that a lot of this is based in a cultural understanding of the time, a cultural understanding of the context. And it's that cultural understanding that often we need to have before we can interpret the parable. Of course, the Israelites went one step beyond this, and particularly the rabbis go one step beyond the concept of parable to a specific kind of parable called an allegory. An allegory. Now, in an allegory, not is the whole story got a meaning, but rather every component, every element of that story has a parallel meaning. Now, if you read some of the writings of the rabbis, particularly of the Torah, so things like, for example, the story of Adam and Eve in the garden, you start realizing is that they begin to actually ascribe a parallel meaning to every aspect of the story. So the snake and the fruit and the trees and the different trees and Adam and Eve and God, and each one gets a particular sub-meaning or a parallel meaning. In fact, for the Israelites, and particularly for the rabbis, the highest level of interpretation is not the literal. In fact, for them, the literal interpretation is the lowest level of meaning. The highest level of meaning is, in fact, the allegory or the allegorical method of interpretation. And so the way in which they wrote was always to see what was behind the words, what was the other possible meaning of the words. And so when you look at that in a parable, always be aware that a parable is not just giving you a nice story, but rather a parable is wanting to teach a truth. Maybe even sometimes multiple truths. Sometimes there are multiple levels to parables. And what it's wanting you to do is to peel out those different levels so that you can get to each level of truth, each level of concept underneath that particular literal one that you would encounter. If we don't do that, we often miss the impact and the concept of what the parable was for. So when you look at a parable, never look at just the literal. The idea of the parable is to unpack it and to find the symbolic behind, to find the meaning behind the story.